Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Crime Over Wine, the only podcast with head-scratching true crime stories that are just better over a bottle of wine. I'm your host, Liam Collins, and this week, my guest co-host is an attorney that is based in Northwest Georgia, and also the author of The Zenith Man. That's the story of Alvin Ridley and Virginia Ridley that you heard all about last week. And now, my guest co-host, you're going to hear the full, unedited conversation that we're about to have with McCracken Poston. Hello, McCracken. How are you doing this week?
Thank you, Liam, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, McCracken, so just to tee it up again for anyone who may not listen to the last week's episode, you are the attorney who represented Alvin Ridley for all those years, right? And so you wrote the book, The Zenith Man, about Alvin Ridley and his story and your conversation with him about Virginia too. And so kind of, if you don't mind kind of getting me there first off about why write a book about it, right? Because I'm sure I know you've had a lot of really interesting cases and stories. Why this one particularly?
Liam, I really found my a line from Maya Angelou that completely explained. She said, "Bearing there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." Mm-hmm. And I knew exactly what she meant when I read that line, because I've been since January the 15th, 1999, when I walked out of the courthouse with Alvin Ridley, a free and innocent man. I knew this should be told. And I struggled with it for over 2 decades. I gave the story away whenever anybody would come calling and say, yeah, sure, we'll participate in this podcast, or we'll participate in this documentary or TV show. So Forensic Files came, did a very popular show in their 5th season. American Justice with Bill Curtis did another very popular show, and I know this because now all these people are on Reddit, and
right.
And they talk about the same episodes over and over again.
Yeah.
But this episode has been rerun over 20 years, about every month, it seems. And so I get the emails, hey, tell me about Alvin Ridley. And then they're shocked to learn that he's still alive. And Alvin will turn 82 in a few weeks, just a couple of weeks after the book comes out. And so, they're thrilled to learn it, but it was really only a book in my head, finally, the final piece of the puzzle, 3 years ago when Alvin was diagnosed with autism. That explained everything that was not well explained in the past by all these other tellings of the story. Well, here's this odd guy. That's pretty much all these stories left it with, is what an odd guy. But, we think he looks innocent in this, and but otherwise he's really strange. And the autism diagnosis, which was suggested by a former juror speaking to Will Davis, podcaster at UTC, who was doing a long series podcast about the case. He was interviewing a former juror in Alaska. And she said, I've become a nurse since I was on that jury, and I really think, Mr. Poston should see if Alvin is autistic. Well, with his permission, I immediately made an arrangement with a doctor in Atlanta who dealt with adults with autism. And Alvin wanted me to go. And one of the two questions in the evaluation, the doctor asked, tell me what these two statements, how it makes you feel. And one was, she's gotten under your skin. Well, Alvin recoiled. He just thought, that sounds horrible, because he was taking it so literally. And the other one was, he wears his heart on his sleeve. Well, Alvin said, I know what that is. He has an artificial heart. And it was so interesting the way Alvin interpreted that, because I have an insulin pump, and I very often refer to it as the pancreas in my pocket. And Alvin, I think, thought, man, I can relate to that guy wearing his heart on his sleeve. It's like you with your organ that you carry around, So I knew at that moment that everything just came rushing into my head. All of our difficulties, all of our struggles, and I'm left with a huge feeling of guilt. Guilt because Alvin's autistic mannerisms were used against him at trial by the state. Alvin's autistic mannerisms were things that I fought him over. Why do you want to talk about this ancient civil litigation why do you want to talk about the county taking your van when we have a murder case? And he would answer, well, I didn't do that, but the county did take my van. So to him, it was extremely logical. And to me, it was extremely illogical. And we fought. Now, we figured out a way to put up a defense. But it was a struggle. And I don't know if, he was tested back in 1998. Nobody was testing for autism then. There was not a lot of talk about autism in adults then. There was talk about autism in children, and they had just come up with the spectrum talk. And the idea that this is a number of developmental disorders that... And a lot of times the focus was, let's find a blame for it. And in reality, autistic people have been with us since time began.
Yeah.
And many of our greatest minds and greatest artists and producers of, contributions to our culture have been from people on the autistic spectrum. And it also explained why Alvin Ridley was such a good TV repairman.
Yeah.
It's because he was really laser focused. He could be laser focused. And of all the people on the potential jury and of all the people I've ever talked to, I've never met a person who had a bad dealing with Alvin as a TV repairman.
And, so going back to what you're talking about before about, the era that we were kind of in the late 90s, right, related to, to developmental disorders and to, to mental health disorders and things adjacent to that as well. I'm wondering, did you, because you were very vulnerable in your book as well, and even to me right now about the bias that you had, the lack of knowledge that you had about autism and other disorders related to that. Do you look back now and think that you were ignorant?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and obnoxious, thinking that I knew it all, and not dismissing outright what he wanted to tell me about how he had been done wrong. It made no sense to me at the time, and slowly over time, after a series of further humiliations, I realized, I gotta hear this guy out. And ultimately, it was his call. Some legal strategies, only the client can make. And he made them very unusually, but those were his to make. And I had to figure out, thanking God that he made me study this ancient civil litigation, which the DA brought up, in the trial. So I was ready only because Alvin made me get ready. He would not work with me on the murder case until I studied and talked to him about the many old civil cases that he brought and against just about everybody. But they all came up, and so to be prepared was pretty much a really good thing.
I'm wondering going back to, again, January 15th, 1999, walking out of that courtroom, what was that feeling like to you? Can you remember what was going through your head at that?
In the first place, we had a roller coaster of a trial. The one expert, the epilepsy expert, Dr. Braxton Bryant Wanamaker from South Carolina, he was brilliant. He not only explained the markings on Virginia's body as being from a seizure, but he also explained the voluminous writing that I had found in the house. He explained it as an adjunct of temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition called hypergraphia. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, that was one of the weird things. I thought, how can I explain why this lady's writing everything down? But now I could. And then that was a high point. And then we had another expert who was a complete disaster. Mm. He was a complete disaster. And kind of made some indications that he had been doing a lot of autopsies in the U.S. Turns out he wasn't licensed to do anything in the U.S. And how did I end up with this guy? I found him on the internet. This is 1998. You think that everything on the internet is good and vetted and checked out.
Yeah.
Alvin loved this guy. And it was the most engaged that Alvin got in the case was when we were talking about this guy, this forensic pathologist. Alvin would make me spell it all the time, forensic pathologist. And he would write it down. It would take forever. So Alvin was more excited and more involved in the case when we were talking about this guy coming up and being our witness. And yet he was a complete disaster. And then, with some divine intervention, Mr. Ridley took the stand when Jesus advised him to, against his lawyer's advice. So it's just was a roller coaster. So by the time we got to Alvin's testimony, he did brilliantly. He was charming. Jurors were laughing, and I'm thinking, this is a murder trial, and they are smiling, and this is not bad. This is not a bad position to be in. So by the time, it was just a roller coaster of emotions. So when I walked out on the porch of the courthouse, and I tell you, that porch has meant so much to me over the years, and to Alvin. We both sought office, and we both gave speeches on that porch. I did so more than Alvin because I was in office and for a few years. But we both had done that, and it was meaningful to us, and it stood for something. And yet here we are now out there facing the media and a crowd that has spilled out of the courthouse. And I got to tell you, it was the best experience I ever had on that courthouse steps, on that porch. And so I was just winging it. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Alvin Ridley, a free man and an innocent man. And then I said, and a man who wants to restore his reputation in this community. And I went back and listened to it on one of the local TV stations' feeds. And I think maybe I've finally done that with this book. And it's kind of the definitive statement of here's how we got Alvin wrong. And so I'm hoping that's what this book does.
Do you remember when the jury went to deliberate, did you feel confident enough that they were going to return a not guilty verdict?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Because anything could happen.
Yeah.
I gave up on trying to guess jurors or predict their verdicts. I just knew that I had put up the best defense that I possibly could, but I didn't know if that was going to be enough. I worried very much about Alvin. I don't think he would live very long in any kind of custodial situation. And so I just felt a little guilt as well, because I just thought, man, I wasted a lot of time arguing with this guy. And I still didn't know what was behind Alvin's neurodiversity, now that we know to call it. But but he was definitely diverse.
Yeah. And today, you told me previously about how you're very close friends with him as well. Even again, you said before, a lot of people are surprised he's still with us, but he very much so is, and you two stay in contact. Am I right about that?
Alvin gave me a second act. I had been in politics for a decade. I'd pretty much concentrated on that constituent service as opposed to client service. And, I ran for Congress and got the hell beat out of me, and was pretty much, rolled out of politics just because of the changing Georgia. And so, Alvin gave me a second act. He also ultimately allowed me to pick criminal defense as pretty much my concentration, and that's pretty much all I've done for the last 20 years.
And you told me this before, and I was pleasantly surprised toward the end of your book about the way that that Alvin ended up finding you to begin with. Can you tell me that story, because it's incredible?
It was eerie. Well, in the first place, Virginia had not been seen since September 15, 1970. That was the last place she was ever seen in public. And that was in the Catoosa County Courthouse, in the large courtroom that the latter half of our trial was in. And so I'm not a big ghost tour person, even though my friend Amy Petula has a great ghost tour in Chattanooga and wrote a great book too about the Corpse Wood murder case. You should have her on.
Yeah.
But Amy makes a living off ghosts, and I will say that finishing the trial in the courtroom where Virginia was last seen was so eerie that it just made me think, what if she was what if she was pulling the strings and making Alvin and I do this dance to where we end up infesting the first courtroom with scores of roaches because Alvin would not allow me to keep the evidence or treat it, for that matter. He brought it every day. He took it home and reshuffled the order, the semblance of order that I tried to put it in, and left the suitcases open. It gets full of roaches. He brings them to the courthouse. He opens them up. The roaches get out. If you'll watch the Forensic Files episode, juror Kimberly Barnes is talking about the roaches coming out of the suitcases. And so Judge Van Pelt said, look, we're moving into the large courtroom. His office was right next to the small courtroom, which was getting full of roaches. So he wanted to fumigate that courtroom and put us in the large courtroom. Well, I was excited because that was the last place Virginia had ever been seen, and now we're using her own words to defend Alvin. And it just really lifted me. It got me kind of charged up about it because it was not always an easy case. Things were not always going our way. And so it was a wonderful, eerie feeling. Now, to go back to your original question, I would ask Alvin, especially when I was frustrated, why did you pick me? The way Alvin and I got started, I knew him all of my life. He went to high school with my oldest sister, but that was like the year I was born. And so I really didn't know him that well, but my dad was a real friend of Alvin's. my dad, who liked to, if he could save a nickel by, going way out of the way, he would do it. And he and Alvin had this kind of bartering, trading arrangement. My dad ended up with a Zenith TV. My sisters and I wore the tuner knob off of it. And I only remembered this during the representation, that when I was about 12 or 13, Alvin came to our house and gave me a stern lecture on how to turn a TV knob. Now, this was before remotes, and you just literally, there was a plastic knob on a crescent pin, and, if you spun it too hard, you wore out that plastic, and you just had a spinning knob that wasn't changing your channels. So as I recall, we had a pair of pliers that we were changing the TV with. But Alvin shows up on a Saturday when I'm trying to watch live wrestling. My mother apparently waves him on in, because suddenly here's this strange guy in my living room holding a TV tuner, which he could have literally just popped on and left. But he puts it on, gives the TV a general sprucing up. But the reason I remembered the conversation was he told me then, because I went and told all my friends, and then he told me again in my office while I'm representing the guy for murder, that he met Andre the Giant behind Memorial Auditorium in Chattanooga. And he told me what Andre the Giant ate for breakfast, which was like ungodly dozens of eggs and loaves of bread. And I remembered it then because I went and told all my friends I met a guy who met Andre the Giant. And I remembered it then when he told me in my office in 1998. I said, we've had this conversation before. You're the guy. And it all came rushing back to me about the lecture I got about the TV knob. So it was fortuitous because, it gave us a connection. But I asked Alvin when I would get frustrated with him, to get back to your original question, why did you pick me? And he would always put me off. He would always put me off. And at the very end, he brings a VHS cassette tape. And he won't let me keep it, but he's going to let me see it. And in the many uses of this tape, recording over, and there was a kind of what was the remnants of a label on it. But on that label was my name in the very distinct handwriting of Virginia Ridley, which freaked me out because I had discovered all of her writings. We had to have them evaluated to assure any finder of fact that it was her writing. The only known writing we had of hers was their marriage license application, but she had a very distinctive way that she carried the lower reaches of a letter, a flare, and then there were several other points of comparison. But there's my name, and I just so happen to have a dual VHS cassette and DVD player. Well, at least I had a VHS cassette when I'm getting my timelines mixed up. And we popped it in, and it was the only televised debate in the congressional race that I lost. And he said, she liked you. And, of course, not enough to go back and get out and register and vote, but she liked me. And maybe that had something to do with him stalking me 2 days after her death for advice. So it sent chills. It sent chills down my spine. But it was just, it put things into perspective for me. There's a number of great reasons that I lost that congressional race, and it gave me peace for losing that. I didn't try to jump right back into politics, and maybe I needed to be here for Alvin. Alvin has a very active theories about what God has done to help him. For example, sending Jesus to tell him to testify during lunch.
Yeah.
And those kind of
Which I'm
things.
sure you loved. So.
Yeah. Of course, I thought it was Salesman Sam, my usual interferer of legal advice. But, I just really, this case is so personal to me because of the way it settled my life in so many ways, and gave me peace and understanding of why things happen the way they do.
Yeah. Well, and you didn't always have that either, too, right? Because you again expressed very vividly your discomfort, dislike, times
absolutely.
Of Alvin, and even to the point where you at the very beginning of representing him, thought that he was guilty, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just think this guy's been weird all along. He used to post missives on the inside of the glass of his shuttered building that had been shuttered for 15 years, and the weather was getting in it, and it was just a nasty place. And I would go read them to see if I'd made the list, of people he was damning. But my dad always had kindness in his heart for Alvin. Now, my dad was going through, suffered from alcoholism. And it was not easy as a kid. Nothing mean. It wasn't a mean bone in his body. And he never was abusive toward any of us. He was just a sad alcoholic. And a kid can just torture their own minds to try to figure out, what is my role in this? Why is he like this? Maybe I'm not doing what I should be doing. And so I realized when I was writing Alvin's story, I started realizing what I was going through. I started reading my late mother's journals about kind of, I wanted to see if she referenced the time I brought Alvin to her house a couple of times, to see my parents, just to calm him down. And again, my dad had a great calming effect on Alvin. But I remembered that we had an intervention. We put our dad in a hospital, and he had a reaction to some Ambien, and I went and stayed with him. And we ended up talking about my meeting Alvin on the street and talking to him. And my dad said, son, he's just different, but he's a good man. And so I tried to start seeing him as my dad saw him, and not as Ringgold, as a majority of Ringgold saw him.
Right.
He was the boogeyman. People were afraid of him. And he was acting that way. He would be reacting to the way people were treating him. It was a vicious cycle.
Yeah. And what specifically about him, kind of at the beginning, kind of rubbed you? I mean, because you tell a lot of these stories, right? About, I think you told me that you were literally trying to hold him down when he was at trial, right? So he wasn't run out of the courtroom. Those kinds of things that, just were sitting right with you either, right?
Well, I was, Liam, I just was kind of pissed off at the world at first. I was, people would try to counsel me that, you don't need to do that case. There was a late judge, not a judge of the court we were in, but another judge, who said, with concern, people are saying you two deserve each other. And, I was kind of mad at the world, and I thought, I don't care if he did it. I'm going to help him, My dad likes him, what the heck, So the more I started realizing, hey, this guy may be innocent, it was almost like a pressure that I was suddenly weighing. And I think the time that I finally kicked it into overdrive was when my former opponent, the congressman, called my office, and Alvin happened to be there. And when the secretary said the congressman called and here's his number, Alvin kind of sat up straight, and I thought, oh God, he thinks the congressman's calling about him. because Alvin and ultimately we learned Virginia, they believed in federal government. Mm-hmm. They believed that federal government was going to save them. And they did not believe in state or local government. They thought state and local government was out to get them and torment them. Mm-hmm. But there were several episodes where Alvin was seeking the help of federal government, such as when he fled the courtroom and ended up in Rome, Georgia, doused with gasoline, and ended up in a federal judge's office getting detained by U.S. Marshals. That was just a few days before we picked a jury for his case and started his trial. So, there were other instances where Alvin would flee and head to some federal agency, such as the VA. It was really interesting then when I had a congressman calling me, and I thought, well, I'll impress Alvin here. He seems to be interested. So I picked up the phone and called and said, "Hello, Congressman." It's the first time I'd talked to him since I conceded defeat to him. And he and I served together in the state legislature. He was in the state Senate, and I was in the state House. And I'd supported him before when he ran for Congress. And then, the world changed, and I challenged him, and I got put in my place. But in any event, here he is calling me, and I'm thinking, I wonder how I can help him. I wonder if he wants to ask my opinion on something. He gets on the phone, and he says, "Keep Alvin Ridley away from my congressional district offices." And I'm sitting there looking at Alvin, listening to him.
Oh, God.
And I said, "Well, I'll pass it on, Congressman." That's all I could say. And I thought, how am I going to tell Alvin this? First, I don't want him to get arrested for harassing the congressional district office ladies. I knew all of them. Mm-hmm. So I pretty much promised them they could keep their jobs during my campaign. And so I knew them, and I didn't want them bothered by Alvin, but I certainly didn't want Alvin getting more reputations for being weird or being difficult or being out of control. So I pulled him outside, walking him to his car, and I said, "Alvin, I got to tell you something." And I was thinking, how am I going to tell him? How am I going to tell him? So I said, "That damn congressman?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "He hates me so much that he said if me or you show up at his congressional offices, he's going to have us both arrested. If either one of us shows up, he's going to have us both arrested." And he looked kind of bewildered. And I said, the election. And he looked more bewildered because he knew I'd been, swamped in the thing. So he had no idea why the congressman would be threatened by me in any way. So, but I told him, I said, "Alvin, if you'll just cooperate with me, when this is all over, I'll show you where he lives." Mm. And it was an idle threat. It was just something to make him think I'm on your side, and let's outsmart him, and you cooperate with me, and then when it's all over, I'll show you. I'll take you to his house, that kind of thing. Well, that call rallied me. Because now there was an air of, look how far you have fallen. You're representing this crazy guy. Now, I'm telling you, keep him away from my congressional offices. Mm-hmm. So I was inspired. If I ever thought of walking away from Alvin Ridley, that was over. Mm. That I was going to work my ass off for Alvin Ridley, no matter what the outcome. Mm. And then things started happening that Alvin kind of grows on you. He charmed the people in my office, the couple of secretaries, even the other lawyer secretaries, the high school runner intern, people started realizing this guy is actually a very polite, especially around women, extremely quiet and polite and respectful. Mm. Now, with he and I, we would yell at each other at first, and yell at each other to the point where we couldn't get anything done. And he would always yell about the same things, the county taking his van in 1984. Well, this was 1998. And so 14 years, he's still obsessing about this van. And at some point, I just got so frustrated. I just said something like, "Good Lord," or "Oh Lord." And he stopped. And I look, and he's praying. He thinks I'm praying. So he stops his yelling to join me in this prayer. So I just winged it. I just started praying my advice to him with eyes closed shut, and he listened. And he would be very calm when I would give him advice in the style of a prayer. And sometimes it was evangelical. Sometimes I would tell him how much we needed this, and I needed to get in his house because the state had been in there through the officers, and I need to be there, and God wants me to go in there. And he would end up that conversation always with, "I'll think about it." That was the put off that he always gave me. Anyway, it was just things that I was already having to adapt to be able to communicate with him. But I was happy to do it because it felt like I was finally getting through to him.
Yeah. Well, and so it's one thing for you to deal with that and to learn how to adapt to that as well. But then when that's playing out in a courtroom, totally different ball game, right? And so I guess I'm wondering, when you started seeing, what in your own words, like, his mannerisms that you now know to be autism, being played against him, did you know that there was, that this was unfair, that this was, that this was just how he was? Or did you kind of say, yeah, you're kind of right, like he's a little out there, or what was going through your head, I suppose?
Well, in the state's defense, my friend Buzz Franklin, the DA, in their defense, he was not very, his emotions did not meet the moment of having just lost his wife. They were making a big deal out of that. And I couldn't explain it. I just thought, maybe he's just kind of an emotionless guy. He's kind of a flat effect kind of guy. His call to 911 was very flat, except for the very end where he said, "Please hurry." And to me, that wasn't, that was about as emotional he's going to get. But at the same time, at moments in the police report, he would break down in his house. And there have been moments over the years that Roberta Flack song, "The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face." Just, we'll be at a restaurant and that will come on in the background and the guy just completely falls apart. And he says, "Virginia loved that song." And so I've also seen him, and I understand this happens in some persons with autism, that they kind of absorb the emotion in a room. And then at a time that's not always deemed appropriate, it'll come out. For example, when both of my parents died individually, about 10 years apart, Alvin just kind of stood around, took it, and then, 3 weeks later, he'd be in a complete meltdown. "What's wrong, Alvin?" "Well, your daddy died." And I said, "Yeah, I know, Alvin. It's just, I'm with you now. Your daddy died, and my daddy died. We kind of relate." He's really a smart man, and I think wise to the world. That's why he was always thinking that I was trying to pull one over on him. And I think finally he realized, okay, he really is trying to represent me. So he stopped directly interfering.
That's good.
Yeah.
That was a good thing to hear from a client, right?
A friend of mine said, they wrote a review actually there's been you've read the book, and so there's early reviews get out to people, and this is a guy that's in the business. So he wrote a review. He said that I was representing a client hell-bent on kneecapping his own defense. And I thought, that is exactly what has happened.
Yeah.
I wish I'd come up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. What's your, so going back, you said January 15th, 1999, you got that?
No, not January. Yeah. That was the, and it's funny that Alvin is so good with dates.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm trying to be. So that was when he was acquitted. That was the day he was acquitted.
Yeah.
And of course that's where the book ends. The book begins the night that I lost my congressional race, and happened to run into Alvin. Anytime anything was going on downtown Ringgold, Alvin thought people were trying to break into his dilapidated, shuttered, completely water-soaked building, and he was guarding his building. And he knew I had lost the race because he said, "You got beat, didn't you?" And that was the first time I'd talked with him in a couple of years. I had a situation when I was a state representative where another guy who was kind of one of our characters in town, he hitchhiked to the state capitol. And I didn't know the guy was capable of I knew his family, and I knew he had some type of developmental disability, or his sister used to say he was kicked in the head by a mule when he was a kid. But here he was at the state capitol, and I thought, what am I going to do with him? Well, he gets lost. I lose him. And finally, I involve like 5 agencies, and I find my constituent, which I'm being given complete grief over. Poston's lost a constituent. He's involving all these state agencies and police forces.
Oh, gosh.
And so I finally found the guy, and I said, John, why are you here? As I was buying him a bus ticket back to Chattanooga, and told Ringgold's only cab driver, Bob Poteet, go to the bus station and get John Howard and take him to his sister's house. But John Howard he came to see his government because Alvin Ridley was cashing his monthly disability checks, and Alvin Ridley was keeping 15%. And I thought, I can fix this. Go to the bank, get an account. The bank will give you 100%. And he was so thrilled that government was working for him, And so I came home and I saw Alvin Ridley on the street. This was about 1992, perhaps about 7 years before I was representing him. And I said, Mr. Ridley, quit cashing John Howard's check. There's like laws against that kind of thing. And he's going to go to the bank and get it done. And he just stared at me. He didn't even respond. And it was a pretty menacing stare. So I kind of got what people were getting from him, the vibe. In reality, Alvin and a lot of people with autism are just trying to process what you're saying. And if you're speaking in metaphors and figurative speech, they're not going to understand you. It's a processing issue.
Yeah. Right. And that was again, at that time, from people, again, who listened to last week's episode and who, have read the book, know that, that was a major, part of the misunderstanding, I suppose, right, about or the reputation that Mr. Ridley, that Alvin had, developed for himself in Ringgold, right, was somebody who was always staring at you and who was off-putting to people, right, and so that all built into why he may have or likely killed his wife, which again we all know today is not true.
Absolutely. And Liam, there are 5.5 million estimated undiagnosed adults with autism. And unless they have families that are helping the neurotypical world interpret them, they're going to be having encounters with police and courts. And I can't help but think that they are getting the short end of the stick on that. They're probably in conflict with their lawyers, probably a lot of them publicly appointed lawyers who are going to be very frustrated and overworked anyway. But then they have to deal with this person who's just not responding as the way you think they should. So I hope that the book does highlight this issue and perhaps includes on state psychological evaluations some type of rule out autism test. And now that I've seen it in Alvin, I'm seeing it everywhere. I have a current client with autism, a young man, beloved in his school, and he had a seizure. His grandmother called for an ambulance, and a lot of times first responders are actual law enforcement officers. And, he's coming out of a seizure and, of course, ends up with obstruction charges because being misunderstood and not responding as law enforcement thinks you should respond, that's what results in obstruction charges, sometimes felony obstruction charges. Mm-hmm. So I immediately got it with this kid and confirmed it with his grandmother. Oh yes, he's autistic.
Mm. And you seem to be so much more knowledgeable these days about these kind of disorders, than you were 20 years ago, certainly 25 years ago. What was it Alvin who entirely sparked that interest?
Absolutely. He's been an enigma to me until just 3 years ago. Mm. These were stories that, of course, we told the TV shows, mm-hmm. but none of them explain Alvin. Mm. And the Reddit community, for example, there were some people pretty, they were commenting on, they would say, look at the way he's looking at his wife's grave. That's so cringy. And, I gently got on and said, look, I'm his lawyer. You need to know he has autism. Mm. And you're misinterpreting his visual cues just like he would be misinterpreting our verbal ones.
Yeah. So I wonder what inspires you to want to do that? Do you feel a little responsible to a certain extent to be able to do that? Or is it simply just because, Alvin can't necessarily do it himself the way that, neurotypical or people are able to do it?
My secretary, Carlene, she was not the secretary during the trial, but she's been with me for 15 years. She previously worked with the developmentally disabled at Lookout Mountain Community Services, and she is incredibly good at it and incredibly good with my clients who fit that profile. And she and I, Alvin comes by and plops down and sits and talks, and we're never going to ask him to leave. I may say, Alvin, I've got to go to court, or so many, many years ago, he had an issue again, and he had not seen me in a while. And he comes in, and I took care of it. And he was kind of a victim of an elder scam. Mm. And I just took him and got his phone number changed, mm-hmm. and said, don't ever answer those kind of calls again. And I said, by the way, Alvin, you want to get some lunch? Have you had your flu shot? And he said, yes and no, So we went and got him his flu shot when I got mine, and got him lunch. And then I said, we should do this every now and then. Well, Alvin says, how about Tuesdays, And so I thought, okay, every week then. And so as he's gotten into over 80, we've increased that to 2 days a week. Mm-hmm. And, if I'm at all able, I will take him to lunch. If I can't, my secretary will on my dime. and it's just it's very rewarding in a way. Alvin tells the same stories all the time, but then out of the blue, a new one will come out, and it's like going back to old Ringgold from when I was a child. Just even the way he talks, the memories he's having, and I feel very blessed to be his friend. And it's so counter to what everybody thought of Alvin Ridley in the 1980s and 1990s. And some still do. Some, quite frankly, are not quite ready to accept Alvin or his innocence. But I know he's genuine, and I know he very much loved his wife. And because of the gift that Virginia left behind, we all know that she loved him to the very, very end.
Yeah. What do you want people to take away from? You've been doing a lot of these kind of interviews. You again wrote the whole book. What do you want people to take away from reading the book, from doing this kind of podcast? What do you want people to learn from this?
Well, it's funny. One of the reviews of the book said, "I sure wish, I don't care about the author. I wish I could have seen more of Alvin's point of view. There's no way I could write Alvin's point of view. That would involve me taking on this ability or disability in processing information. The story is about how two very different men had to come together to figure out a way to work with each other, because he had an extremely high risk of being convicted of something he didn't do.
Right.
And so, but it's also, as I wrote it, I started realizing how I was changed in this period of time, and going through what I was going through with my father's finally getting sober at the end. And that's some stuff that I don't care how old I was, 39, but I was still, a kid basically to see that happen. And then I'm also realizing of all the blessings of unanswered prayers, because had my prayers been answered, I would have been in Congress and not even in Ringgold most of the time when all this was going. I married during my advising Alvin Ridley, and have 3 children, really 4, with my now ex-wife. I explore the things that in me, that growing up with an alcoholic parent probably led to some of my own difficulties in terms of relationships and what have you. And so I'm just feel very blessed that this case drew all of this out of me, and I'm at peace. I'm at peace with. I'm just glad everything happened the way it did, the timing that it did, because my 3 children were born in Kazakhstan. They were already going to be in existence. I had to be in the very right place at the very right time to become their father, and they are the biggest joys of my life. And then my ex had a baby years after our divorce who needed a father figure, and he's my kid's little brother. So I just he's kind of also my son. And those are the blessings that I wouldn't have had my dad not said, Alvin's all right.
Yeah.
He just thinks differently, and that's just the way he interpreted it. But I hope people get. I've been told, my publisher, when I sent her the manuscript, first place, my first take on it was 177,000 words. Well, my contract was for 90,000 words.
You sound like me.
Yeah, so I ended up having to hack away story, and I hated that, because I love this line of story. but I think I got it down to the bare bones, and it still weighs in at a little over 100,000 words. But the publisher said that's fine. So then I sent her that manuscript, and she went skiing. And I'm thinking, okay, is it okay, And so I started looking up ski reports to see if there'd been any avalanches out where she went. And I could just see her iPad sticking up out of a snowbank, and, there goes my book. And she finally wrote me, and she said, my companion asked me why I was laughing so much. And she said, I told her I was reading your book. And then she said, on the flight back, my colleague, my companion, asked me why I was crying. And she said, I told her it was because of your book. Mm-hmm. So I managed to hopefully tell things that people will relate to.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who's human, who perhaps dealt with someone they loved so much, but who suffered from addiction, someone perhaps with an autistic child or an autistic brother or sister or friend will recognize the things that I was missing completely. And at the time, I had an autistic niece, but she was a child, and I was not getting the same vibe that I did with Alvin.
Because you talked a lot about the lessons, I suppose, the growth that you've had after representing Mr. Marsh, and then you also talk a lot about the lessons and the growth that you've had after representing Mr. Ridley. How do you conflate those two, I suppose? How do you relate those two in terms of did you grow in a larger way here, or just a different way here, if that makes any sense, as a person?
Well, we seem to never learn the lessons that we've been learning and relearning since the dawn of man. Don't judge people. I mean, we have of course, a justice system that does judge people, but that's something we all need as a civilized society. But just just on our in our daily lives, there was a lot of judgment being passed down, and it's really interesting. Just the evolution of these cases, and how, to me, I saw the true humanity in these people that the general public were calling monsters. And I really saw the humanity in both these men, and I'm very proud to call them my friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll say, cause I love the book, right? Just as much as it sounded like your publisher did, which is always a good sign from a publisher, I would imagine. So, anyways, right? But it was so refreshing, and I told you this earlier before we hopped on this call. It was so refreshing because I have read so many true crime books, right? That are like traditional investigating, who did what. And it had that, same sense of gravity there, and same sense of intensity, but still with that of very, again, refreshing amount of levity. And we were talking before about how you were able to kind of bring down a lot of that language that a lot of lawyers, investigators can use, which I found, again, really, really refreshing and inviting, for sure. So I appreciate that because it gave me a little something different. And so tell everyone, so your book will have already been out by the time people are listening to this. Tell everyone where they can find it, how they can order a copy if they're interested.
Well, I would love it if they would order it. And if they're local, just come to Ringgold, and you can meet Alvin. And if it's on one of our lunch dates, you can join us, and he'll sign your book as well. But it's called The Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom. There are 2 books called Zenith Man available right now. The first one is also our story that someone wrote, changing our names and changing the location. And it's an extremely short book. My only issue was, because, like I said, I've been giving the story away for years. My only issue was, at first, there was not a statement that this is based on a true case. That's all I wanted, and ultimately the author did do that. So I will credit this author for getting me off my butt to make me realize, if I don't write this, obviously somebody else is going to. And that motivated me to finally just buckle down and do it. I had a wonderful developmental editor in California who gave me the confidence that I could write. I shared with her some of my very, very early anecdotal, chapters. And it was a chapter about one of these incidences, the skunk incident. And I'm going to make your audience really want to read this book. The skunk incident, the cats incident, and all these different things that were great stories to tell my friends. And I did. I would probably drive them crazy, because I would end up telling the case, and then an hour later I'd be still talking. So I just, the narrative thread fits because it's the course of a trial and all the preliminary things that you have to do at a trial. So that's what was driving the story. And then just the struggle with Alvin, who very much, he served our country. He did something that I didn't do. He served our country in the military. And I've always admired him for that. I buy him caps that say U.S. Army veteran, which he loves to wear because he loves to be thanked for his service. And people buy him lunch a lot and dinner out when he's out. So Alvin, a lot of people thought Alvin was a bit of a con man. But I think Alvin truly, that's his way of interacting with people. If people are feeling sorry for him and helping him, that's human interaction. And so, I don't mind at all. My secretary and I, we keep him, we buy him new clothes from Land's End. We've got his sizes. But Alvin won't wash the ones we get him. So he'll wear them until they literally are tattered. And then we'll say, okay, here's the new ones. And then he'll look good for a few days, and then it'll start looking kind of rough. He just, he's happy, though. He's happy and set in his ways.
Yeah.
And at one point, when I didn't know what Alvin's issues were, I was angry at him because of some stuff he did in court. And I kind of got on him about his hygiene. And I immediately resented myself for doing it. The minute it came out of my mouth, I felt horrible. And that gave me the signal of, that he can't help this. But I didn't know that. But something was telling me, that he can't help this. And within 24 or 48 hours, that's when I got besieged by a skunk. And Alvin got to complain about how I smell.
Oh, no.
True story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
man.
So anyway, it's available on every bookseller's platform. It will be it's on Amazon, certainly. It's online at Barnes & Noble. It will be at the Barnes & Noble. If you have a local independent bookstore, just ask them to carry it, and they will. But things are so easy to get right now. It'll be in Kindle form. It'll be in audiobook form.
Excellent. Again, the book's name is Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom, and it is out now wherever you can get your books, wherever you want to get your books or your audiobooks, in person, online, wherever you want to get it. I would be remiss not to ask about another one of your very famous cases, if you don't mind. I know you said you can't go into too much detail, so however much detail you want to go into, but we covered the Ray Marsh case, the Walker County cremator, a couple weeks ago, and so, again, for anyone who is listening to this to this podcast right now, probably listened to that case a couple weeks ago. Can you tell me a little bit about how that all came about, if you don't mind? What you were thinking when you first got that call about what your client was accused of being doing.
Well, I will just say that this family is one of the nicest families ever in life. Not just nicest families I've helped represent, but nicest families I have ever met. Very unusual set of facts. I will always maintain, because I had him tested, that my client was suffering from the effects of mercury toxicity. Mm-hmm. His father, who died during the representation, had other effects of mercury toxicity that affected other organs. But it is a neurotoxin, so it can affect the brain. And nothing untoward was happening to bodies other than not being cremated. And something else returned in their place other than ashes on a number of them. Now, over 2/3 of the bodies sent during the period of time that my young client operated the operation, over 2/3 were properly disposed of. Mm-hmm. So, it was a real study in human nature to me of how the community was reacting. You had a lot of victims of the case who took the position, when I hate it, this happened, it's unfortunate, but my loved one, that's not them. They left, their spirit is gone. So that's not them. There were people, listening to all the class action lawyers who were whipping up big class action suits, and they were rejecting it, saying, that just wasn't my uncle, that wasn't my father, that was their shell of their body, and they diminish if they're not cremated, they diminish over time. And so, I learned a lot about human nature. I learned a lot. I learned a lot of very poignant stories too. My clients were African American. A couple of rough-looking characters approached me at a restaurant in Lafayette, and they got kind of the old Confederate flag tattoo and looking kind of rough, and they asked me if I was the lawyer, and I said, well, yes, sir. And I didn't know if it was fight or flight, It was going to be flight. That was going to be my option. So they said, well, please tell his mother that we said hello. She was our teacher. And they actually had respect for my client's mother. Now, I've represented some people that have done a lot of things and a lot of some despicable things. But this family was not that client. None of them were. Yet a bank, a local bank, closed the account of my client's mother and sent her a check with a note, we don't want your business anymore. And I've represented some people who have admittedly done some awful things. The bank has never closed their account. It's just was people got caught up in the gotcha of the moment. Oh, they're banking with you. Oh, that looks bad. Let's get rid of them. Let's not let them bank with us anymore. And just stuff like that was it was very frustrating.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I can't imagine this was, the internet was there, but I can't imagine now with social media having such a case because, what was there was bad enough, but it was also very informative to me. I could kind of got a few points out that ultimately led us to not a change of venue, but a change of veneer, which meant that Walker County was going to have to get its jurors from another county further away from all the controversy in media. And that was going to be Lee County, Georgia. And ultimately, I filed a series of questions to the Georgia Supreme Court that could be dispositive of some issues. For example, how can you say this was a felony theft when it was a dead body? What's the value of a dead body? There's actually an old 100-year-old case on that says that there's a limited kind of a tort value, a non-specific value, because it's not like, I think it says it's not like pig iron or copper. It's of a diminishing value, whatever is there. So it was pretty fascinating.
McCracken, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this story with me. I feel I just listened to hearing you talk about this. I can't help but laugh with you as though I was, right there with you along this whole thing, because, and again, kind of what I was saying before, refreshing in a way, because it's a serious case, right? Because Miss Ridley passed away, right? She's no longer with us, but still all these stories, I just can't help but kind of, feel what you must have been feeling at the same time, just hearing you talk about it again.
It's a feel-good murder trial story.
Yeah, there you go.
and I want to ask you, please, you've read it, please review it.
Oh, absolutely, I will. Yes.
There's places to review online, and please review it. And I'd ask your listeners, please review it.
Yeah.
That is kind of the mother's milk of authors' work, is to get those reviews out there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Go ahead and do that. And McCracken, where else can people find you anywhere else online?
Absolutely. Twitter, Real Zenith Man, McCracken Poston Jr. on Instagram, Facebook. I've always been McCracken King Poston Jr. And because I'm honoring my father, I dedicated the book to my father and my mother. But I'm easy to find.
Yeah, there you go. Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for coming on, McCracken. It's been a pleasure talking with you and hearing Alvin and Virginia's story over the last 2 weeks. And thank you all again so much for listening. We are going to put all of our sources on our website so you can read absolutely everything for yourself and probably come up with a few theories too. And if you are just loving this podcast and are just looking for a way to tell everyone and anyone about it, the best way to help people discover this podcast is by leaving us a 5-star rating and a review wherever you are listening right now. So make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you're wondering what we have in store for you next week, here's a quick sneak peek. Hello, everybody. It's Liam.
And I'm Liz Bateson. Next week, I'm re-entering the crime vineyard with a case about a house fire that split a family in two. But what do we really know about what happened to the Sauter children?
I can't wait to hear all of your theories on this one, and we will tell you all about it next Wine Wednesday on the next episode of Crime Over Wine.
Proud member of the Podnuga Network.